I find the idea that we are going to culturally change any group, and that needs to be kind of like a first step to addressing these pretty grievous social harms, is kind of a fool's errand. Sure, I can sit here and kind of Bill Cosby style tell people to pull up their pants, and sure, I can tell white people to stop being racist, and I don't know what that's going to do. What I do know as a humanist is that there's people who are homeless, there are people who don't have health care, there are people who are food insecure, and that from a policy perspective, that's always, my goal is always to focus the public conversation on those things that we can actually address materially.
This is not the first time I've had this debate.
Sure.
I think I should mention his name, Adonir Usmani, Usmani. He's a sociologist. He teaches at Harvard. He's an assistant professor of sociology and social theory at Harvard. And he and I have been debating exactly this. He's a man of the left, and he worries a lot about mass incarceration issues. And I'm talking about Adonir, but I'm going to address what you just said momentarily. He has been arguing that he thinks the new Jim Crow narrative, Michelle Alexander and company, is overly simplistic. But he thinks at the end of the day that the root cause is the paucity of the American welfare state. It's the fact that we have, as a society, chosen. He thinks crime's a real problem. He thinks the rise in incarceration is largely a reaction against the rise of violent crime in the 1980s and after. But he thinks that what we did in response to the rise of violent crime was to basically throw people away in the jails instead of addressing ourselves to, as it were, root causes. And I have a couple of responses to that. One is, I think the evidence is less than compelling that throwing money at the root causes, whether it be the schools, or whether it be various kinds of social services to indigent populations or whatnot, will deal with the problem of violent crime. That's a kind of rhetoric that we've been hearing a lot of, but I don't know if there really is good reason to believe that that's the case. I mean, you take the children born out of wedlock in single-parent homes and whatnot. Some people try to argue that it doesn't matter, that it's an irrelevancy. And I can't help but think, and I believe there's evidence to this effect, that it's a very important impediment to the full development and flourishing of African-American youngsters, that there's so much instability in the interpersonal relations within the social matrix that children are born and so forth. Now, we can fiddle around with the welfare policy all we want to, but we're not really reaching the behavioral basis of the problem if we're not prepared to address these questions of values. And who are we? We are not the white supremacists. We are the African Americans who are most concerned about the well-being of our community. And there's a kind of dignity point here. There's a kind of point that, quite apart from policy, there's an issue of how you want to live in the world and what kind of people we are. And the evocation of wealth gap because of redlining and whatever, in the face of the tragic way that many people's lives are working out, strikes me as morally inadequate. And so again, I reiterate, let's have the argument about policy, but let's not avoid addressing to our fellow African Americans the questions about raise your children, keep your nose clean, live decently. There are right and wrong ways of being in the world, and you're not exhibiting what we want to value as an African American community.
Professor, I guess I would say that it's not that we haven't been having that conversation. I don't know that there is any time that I can recall where there hasn't been a robust nucleus of conservative Black folks, perhaps best personified at this point by Bill Cosby, for better or for worse,
Please.
that have always, from Booker T through Bill, who have always espoused some version of that. And that doesn't, I certainly wouldn't deny, of course, there's an economic reality that having a two-parent household, it infers an enormous amount of economic benefit, whatever the cultural benefits additionally may be, right? I think my entire generation is really smarting from the fact that apartments are, in major cities at least, are priced with the kind of expectation that it's going to be two people to a one bedroom. And if you're a single person in a housing market on one salary, it is extremely difficult to live anywhere near your work in an urban center, for instance. So I don't, and when you say people have thrown money at the problem and it hasn't created an effect, I would say two things. I would say first that there are myriad instances where you can demonstrate significant effect by throwing money at the problem in a smart way. But that typically speaking, the way money is thrown at the problem is exactly that. It's thrown at the problem instead of actually addressing root causes. So busing kids instead of addressing the fact that redlining means that Black people live in these historically deprived neighborhoods, don't get any equity out of their housing value, and as a consequence are victims of a wealth gap and a taxation base that means that their schools are dramatically underfunded, right? That the two things are, one, that I would kind of dispute the premise, but almost more importantly for the purpose of this conversation, even if you think that throwing money at a problem doesn't help, I am skeptical that just engaging in this, do better Black folks narrative has any demonstrated value at all.
Okay. That's an unfriendly way of characterizing my position, but
sure. I'm sorry. I don't mean to.
No, it's not inaccurate. It's not inaccurate. That certainly is one way of putting it. And what I'd say is that first, not all poor communities exhibit the same extent and nature of pathology that we're seeing in many of the inner city communities that are of concern here. So I again want to doubt whether or not a simplistic poverty or material deprivation that lies at the root of the problem is.
By not all poor communities, you mean non-Black poor communities exhibit different behaviors. So is it your view that the different historical trajectories of various poor communities, namely that only one community in America has been subject to chattel slavery, isn't the militating factor there, that it's cultural differences? No,
it's a complicated, I only say it to mean that poverty, straight line, causal to behavioral pathology is refuted by the experience of other communities. I would argue in favor of African American exceptionalism on a number of fronts, and chattel slavery would be one of them. I'm very friendly with Orlando Patterson, the sociologist whose work on slavery has led him, this is controversial, to the view that some of what we see in family dynamics, and not only amongst African Americans, but also in other African diasporic communities, can be traced back to the damaging effects of the intercession of masters' property claims over and against the natal organic connections within African American families. People could be sold off. The planter might violate a woman sexually or whatever. It's complicated. It's very complicated. I think it's very hard to know with certainty what all the effects of African Americans' very specific historical experiences is, which is different from any of the immigrant groups, different in its way from the Native American experience. It's very hard to know with any degree of certainty, but I credit that the African American experience is unique. But we're in the year 2021 now, and the 21st century is unfurling before our very eyes. The Chinese won't be held back. Technology is remaking everything. The economy is being transformed. The world is getting small. And I worry that we're on a trajectory where we're going to have within our great cities, they're very dynamic, they're being remade. Gentrification is a bugaboo, but gentrification is inevitable. The repurposing of space is a dynamic that is going to happen. That we're looking at a remnant of the descendants of the enslaved population, and I'm talking about the bottom quintile, the bottom 20-30% in terms of economic and social position of African Americans, who are going to be with us indefinitely. Maybe it's merely a cry from my heart when I say, come on, we really have to address ourselves to the behavioral issues.